In this video, we're going to talk about the permissive period, which is the period of time in U.S. history from colonization to the foundation of America, the United States as a country. And this era is called the permissive period because in general, policies towards languages other than English were somewhat permissive. Languages other than English tended to be allowed. Now, it's important to note that that doesn't mean that English was still not kind of the dominant language. At the time, the founding fathers determined at the Continental Congress that they did not want to make English the official language of the United States. And this was a very strategic move. They decided ultimately their policy was not to have a policy so that they might not create more division at a time when they're trying to really unify people together around this new American identity, this new country that they were founding. So at that time, there was linguistic tolerance towards immigrants, towards people using languages other than English. And to this day, there is no official language in the United States. Sometimes students are surprised to hear that the U.S. does not have a national language. So this has remained our policy since then. And at the time, multiple languages were used in church and state. So people went to church services in languages other than English, and also were taught in languages other than English. Bilingual education at that time and extending into the 19th century, the late 19th century, was pervasive across the United States. In Ohio, for example, over 600,000 students received their schooling in German. A very large percentage of the population spoke German, and schools offered instruction in German and English. You can see Scandinavian languages were used in schools across the Midwest and extending out to Washington. Polish was used in the Midwest, in Chicago and further north, Italian as well, Dutch and Spanish, of course, down in Texas and New Mexico at that time was basically considered to be a bilingual state. So bilingual education is not a new phenomenon. It is something that did exist in the early founding years of the United States as a country as well. Of course, it's important to point out that even while policies were largely permissive towards immigrants and those who were kind of founding the United States as a country, policies were mostly repressive for West African slaves and Native Americans. West Africans who were brought to the United States, forcibly brought to the United States as slaves, were separated from families, intentionally separated from people who shared home languages with them as a means of eradicating their home languages. So definitely not a permissive experience for West Africans. And Native Americans, similarly, were separated from families. Children were brought to boarding schools so that they were not able to maintain ties to their home language and culture. I included here a quote from Captain Richard Pratt, who was a huge leader in the boarding school movement for Native Americans. And this is a fairly famous quote that he gave in a speech at George Mason University that ends with this line, "Kill the Indian in him and save the man." This idea that if we can eradicate what is Indian in this child, we can save their humanity. And because of this type of mentality, many children were brought to these boarding schools where they weren't allowed to use their home language. They were forced to speak English. They were forced to abandon their cultural traditions. And we're still seeing the repercussions of this terrible erasure of culture and generational ties in many Indigenous communities today. So that is the permissive period. So what I want you to do is now is take a moment to just pause, stop the video, or the video will stop, and just jot down anything that you want to make sure you remember about this era. Anything that surprised you, any key takeaways, anything that you're thinking that from this time period is still influencing language and education policies today. And feel free to jot down any questions you have so that we can circle back to them in class.